Hi there, my name is Don Ross, and this is Guitar Case. Guitar Case is my occasional podcast to do with anything guitar-based. The instrument itself, the people who make them, the people who play them, the people who write music for them, everything to do with the instrument, anything you can think of. And today it gives me great pleasure to introduce you all to my luthier for the last 25 years, a wonderful guy named Marc Beneteau. Marc lives in a town called St. Thomas, Ontario, which is in southwestern Ontario, just a little south of London, and London's about halfway between Toronto and Detroit, Michigan. And Marc is originally from Windsor and was based in Ottawa for a number of years and has lived in St. Thomas for most of his career. From there, he makes these amazing instruments and has made them for many different players. And I've had the great delight in playing his instruments exclusively on the acoustic side for the last 25 years. He's made me everything from the most incredible regular pitch six strings to baritone guitars to one of his crowning achievements, a fanfret harp guitar, which a lot of people consider the best one ever made. So without any further ado, I'll take you back a couple of years to a trip I made to southwestern Ontario on a tour, and one of the stops I made was at Marc's place in St. Thomas. So into the Wayback Machine we go. Well, I made it. I'm sort of traipsing around southern Ontario this week. And in between, I've managed to snag the very busy guitar builder, Marc Beneteau. Marc, of course, has been my luthier for about 22 years now. It's kind of crazy. It's time's fun when you're having flies. That's it. That's what I meant to say. So Marc is here. I'm here at his home in St. Thomas, Ontario, where he's been based for quite a long time. I'd like to get a little bit of Marc's background from him to start off. So first of all, Marc, thanks for doing this and welcome.
No problem.
Welcome to Guitar Case.
Always a pleasure.
Yeah, it's nice to have you. And it's nice to see you again. And we went out for dinner the other night, Marc and his wife Gail and I, and we had a nice time. So Marc, you're based here in St. Thomas, and St. Thomas is a small city sort of due south of London, Ontario. How long have you been sort of located around here?
We moved from Ottawa in January of 1986.
Okay,
Yep.
So quite a while.
Yep.
Yeah, and then so you were making guitars in Ottawa before that.
That's where I started my career. Mm-hmm. I was living in Windsor, in my hometown, and at that time I was playing in bands. I was doing the musician thing. But I was also driving a truck, which was making a living doing that, and I realized that was not in my future. One day I was reading an article in, I think it was called Guitar Player magazine, I think, or something like that. It was one of those magazines back in the 70s. And I saw an article on John McLaughlin. I've told this story many times before, and I saw an article on John McLaughlin, and he was playing a custom electric guitar that was built by a young guy, a young luthier, and that was my first connection to that. And I thought, holy shit, Oh, excuse me.
It's okay. It'll be an uncensored podcast. I want people to be themselves.
So anyway, I thought, wow, I had always pictured like my image of a guitar maker was some old guy about 80 years old living in Europe, in the Guild. And here was this young kind of hip-looking guy, and he had built a guitar, and I thought, man, that sounds really cool. So I took it from there. I looked into it and found out there was a couple of guitar courses in Ottawa. One was a night course, and actually they were both night courses, one at the university and one at a local high school. So I decided to just drop everything and go up there.
And you had assumed up to that point that most guitars were factory built, and
Yeah, I had a Martin at the time. My first good acoustic guitar was a Martin D18, which I really quite liked. It was really quite nice, and so then I just started reading all I could on it. I just absorbing it. And at the time, there was very little information out there on guitar making. As you can well imagine, it was in the pre-internet days, so that what you got was the odd book, but I read it all voraciously and really got excited about it.
And these were books you took out of the library, or?
Yeah. One, I ordered one book from Bill Lewis Music in Vancouver. They were selling luthier supplies, and that I still have it. It's a great big tome by a guy named Arthur Overholzer from California, and he had a bit of an odd way of approaching guitar making, but I was just absorbing everything. I also have had a book and still have it by, what was his name?
Hopefully a name as cool as Overholzer.
Yeah, no. Anyway, I forgot. It was sort of the first well-known book on guitar making, and I should know his name, but
that's okay. Well, Overholzer is kind of cute.
Yeah.
Holz in German. German means wood, so it's kind of cool.
Is that right?
Holz, yeah, Holz, yeah.
Oh, you're so worldly. Yes, and the interesting about that book was that he was retired when he wrote the book. He never built instruments during his working lifetime. He did it in retirement, and his strictly was classical, and he had some fairly way out ideas on classical construction, but at the time I was just absorbing everything. I just thought, oh man, it's cool.
Amazing. So you sort of, part of what you learned was very unorthodox out of this book.
Well, I learned it, but I didn't necessarily apply it. He was a weird combination of power tools and totally doing things by hand. So he was at both ends of the scale, where he'd do simple jobs by doing these elaborate fixtures with routers and stuff, and then he'd turn around and do the next thing just by hand. So it was really kind of an interesting approach.
So I'm trying to get the chronology right. Were you still in Windsor at this point, or were you already in Ottawa?
Let me think about that. That's a good question, Don.
I'm just curious because
I think I might have ordered the book while I was still in Windsor, because I decided once I read that article that I really wanted to pursue that, and so there was a number of months before I moved up to Ottawa.
And so you started building in Ottawa.
Yeah.
And were you building completely sort of freelancey, or did you have any way of selling them other than directly to musicians?
The first one, where is it? I still have the first one.
Oh my God, that's amazing.
Just a sec, okay?
Okay, sure, take your time. Well, this is cool.
No, it's not. There you go, Don.
Oh, that's amazing.
This is the first guitar I ever built.
Well, let me make sure I get a quick photo of it. There we go. For the website.
Do you like the position markers?
Those are pretty high class.
Yeah.
Let's see your position markers. I love it.
Yes, yeah. Well, they were added later.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's a custom.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. So Marc just showed me the very first guitar he ever made, and I took a couple of photos, which I'll put up on the website, the Guitar Case website, and that's really something. So, what year was that you made that instrument?
1974, I started it, and I finished it in the spring of 1975.
So we're at 45 years now that you've been making guitars.
Yeah.
That is fantastic. So you started at 3 years old or so.
Yes, absolutely.
Wow, that's great.
Negative years.
Wow, you're like a fetus prodigy.
Yes, and the thing with that guitar is, because I didn't train with anybody, I was basically just slamming my way through it, figuring out just based on what I had learned in books, and the problem. So I made many mistakes with the guitar, and I knew it wasn't very good. And I've also told this story before: is that the tuners on there are old tuners they're old used tuners that I had taken off an electric guitar many years before, and I didn't want to use brand new tuners because I knew the guitar wasn't good enough.
Right. Okay.
So,
good plan.
Yeah.
So it's a dreadnought style guitar.
It is. Yes,
it's very Martin style.
Basically, what we did back then. Right? Yeah. Back then, you'd walk into a music store and 90% of the guitars were dreadnoughts.
Of course. Yeah.
Times have changed quite a bit.
Well, I often tell people that probably when Jean Larive came back from Europe, having studied over there, and decided to sort of introduce some of the, at least some of the design elements of European guitars into his building, it sort of became a look that a lot of Canadian builders ended up emulating.
Absolutely.
I mean, obviously his apprentices would have, but I know you did not apprentice with Larrivée, but obviously he was a big influence on everyone, at least on the Canadian scene for sure.
Yeah, and because I'd come from Windsor and I only knew the factory-made guitars of the time, the Gibsons and the Martins and the Guilds and whatever. I had when I first saw a Larrivée guitar, I was amazed because from his classical guitar background, he was making his electric guitars like classical guitars, and they were just absolutely beautiful, compared to the factory-built guitars that I had been used to. They had like the rosette around the sound hole, and they had wooden bindings, and everything was just so beautifully organic compared to what I was used to. So I jumped on the bandwagon too, just like all his apprentices. And, he had a great influence on Canadian builders.
Yeah, I think just in terms of design and also, it's interesting. Before I started playing your guitars, I'd never heard of these guitars before, but I went into a guitar store in Toronto and I found Loudon guitars. And, the first thing that struck me about them was the look of them. I thought, wow, what a beautiful, voluptuous instrument. I love the curves on it. And it reminded me a lot of the way Canadian builders had been going. So I don't know what happened there. I don't know if George Loudon was influenced by what was happening in Canada, or if because he's sort of in Europe, there in Northern Ireland, maybe that had an effect. I don't know.
I have a feeling that it's the European thing. Because I had a Framus at one time. This was back when I didn't play acoustic guitar. I pretty well played electric, and the Framus had a really slinky neck, so I thought, great, I'll play this. And it was really different. Like the European guitars just seemed to come from a different base, from a different background.
Like the Hofner guitars and stuff like
that.
Yeah, they have just
that's right. They don't look like American guitars,
exactly.
They look European rather than like cowboy,
And they feel a bit different. Exactly. Cool. So you learned mostly out of books. You were basically self-taught as a guitar builder, and of course you learned by doing. So and that's how certainly that's how I learned how to play the guitar. You made your first guitar in 1974 in Ottawa, and then the first one of your guitars that I ever encountered was at the Ottawa Folklore Center, and I think it was in the early 1990s. So it was pretty much very close to the beginning of my career. But for years, people had asked me, have you ever played a Marc Beneteau guitar? So I knew of you, and I knew that you made guitars, but I had never encountered one. And then there was one sitting at the Ottawa Folklore Center, and I had just given a workshop. And I guess it was Arthur who ran the place, Arthur McGregor.
Right.
He came up to me, he says, hey, you've heard of Beneteau guitars? And I said, yes, I have. He says, well, I've got one here. You want to try it? And I was, sure. And I picked it up, and I think it was kind of like a dreadnought style guitar, which wasn't really my thing. But I played it and went, wow, that sounds good. I mean, honestly, I just went, I'm not just trying to blow smoke here. And I thought, that's a nice instrument. And then I looked at the price tag, and I thought, that poor man, how does he make a living?
Well, you've just hit on the problem. I wasn't making any money at that time.
It was incredible.
No.
And I couldn't believe it. I thought, you're charging about the same as a factory guitar,
Yeah.
And I guess with the idea that you thought maybe at the time you had to compete with factory guitars, and of course you don't. You found out eventually, I'm sure, but. I was just flabbergasted, and I thought to myself, wow, if I had that not very many dollars in my pocket, I'd buy it right now, because I was so impressed. And then lo and behold, a few years later, we ended up starting our friendship, and you started building for me, and I've been really grateful that happened, because
that definitely goes both ways.
Well, and I had that early exposure, and I thought, wow, what a great builder! Wouldn't it be great to work with somebody like that? And in my situation, it was interesting because I had that Loudon that I actually bought in 1981, and I loved that guitar. And my daughter has that guitar, still in the family. And I made my first 6 albums on it or so. And then I was in touch. One of my students actually was at the NAMM show, this big trade show in California. And he was there actually with a speaker company. And so the booth right across from them was the George Loudon guitar booth. So, or actually Loudon Guitars, not George. George was not there. So my student Tony told me the story when he got back and he had his next lesson. He says, "Yeah, I'm sitting there across from the Loudon booth, and I came up to the guy there, didn't know who he was. It's an Irish guy, and I said, do you know who Don Ross is?" And he says, he sells a lot of guitars for us over in Canada, kind of thing. And he says, "Well, Don still has his old guitar he's had like 14, 15 years, and it's pretty bashed up. You should give him another guitar." And lo and behold, the guy said, "Hey, here's my card." So I call this number in North Carolina, and this guy with a very broad Northern Irish accent answers. And so he says, "Yeah, sorry, which model do you want?" And I said, "Well, I've been playing an S10. I think it's called an O10 now. It's cedar and mahogany." He says, "No problem. Set that up to you." And then it was like there a week later. And
wow.
I played that guitar for the next several albums. And that guitar now Callum Graham owns. So Gosh. It's sort of almost in the family. And so between then and about 2000, it was sort of going back and forth. All these negotiations were happening with a new group of investors that wanted to take over the company, who eventually did. And that around that time, they said to me, "Well, we should make you a guitar, sort of a custom instrument." And I was just, so, and then it just didn't work out very well. The guitar they made for me ended up not being exactly what I wanted. So I asked them to take it back, and I thought maybe we'd work on something down the line. But in the interim, there was all this legal stuff going on, and all this it was like everybody was suing everybody. It was like the breakup of the Beatles, it was crazy.
Wow.
So at that point, you spoke to me after a show, and I thought, wow, wouldn't it be nice to work with Marc Beneteau? Then it would just be me playing these guitars that I know are really good. I'd be working with one person. I'm one person, and we just have to deal with each other. So my life got a lot easier. And then the nice thing too is that I got exactly the guitars I wanted by dealing with you. It was a dream come true. I'd never had that happen before, where I could just talk to someone and say, "Well, this is what I like in a guitar," and then you make a guitar for me, and it's exactly the way I wanted it, and that's mind-boggling.
Cool. Yeah, that's great. That's fun too.
Anyway, that's a bit of me giving myself an interview about one of the reasons why we worked together was because I couldn't deal with all the complication. That I think things are completely ironed out now with the Loudon Guitar Company, and everything's peaceful and wonderful now. And George is in control; it's no problem. But for a while, there was really quite wild and woolly. So you were based in Ottawa. You had guitars at places like the Ottawa Folklore Center. Were you still at that point building guitars mostly custom order, or were you trying to do sort of the wholesale thing?
Well, the way it started out, like for example, my first guitar, obviously I kept it because it was just my first attempt. Actually, I sold my second guitar to a friend.
Nice. For
$150.
Wow.
That's right. I just wanted to be able to keep going,
The big bucks.
Actually, I was on unemployment. The government was paying my my apprenticeship. And my third one, I think it was $200, and I sold it to a guy down in Windsor, an old friend of mine. And then my first 10 guitars probably went to people that I knew, just so I could get it. And then it didn't take long. Probably by 1976, I think Arthur came into the picture, and he started taking my instruments to sell.
That's awesome.
Started buying instruments, which is great. And at one point, he wanted to take my entire production. Wow. He wanted to, build or take everything I built, and that never worked out. And I'm probably for the best. So it was a combination. Up until 2000, I sold everything in Canada. That's why I wasn't making any money. My prices were too low. And I looked around and saw other people, contemporaries of mine, who were getting a lot more for their guitars. And they were expanding their markets as well, and finally I did that in 2000. But for the first 15 years, I was selling pretty well all in Canada, mostly in Ontario.
Sure. Now, you and I started working together in the late 90s.
Yeah, 97.
Yeah, and I think the first time one of your guitars showed up on a recording was an album that was released in 1999. It was an album called Passion Session. And what happened was you had asked me when we first started working together, you said, well, give it some thought, and you said, try to think of what you really wish you had for a guitar that you don't already have.
Right.
And the first thing that popped into my mind, believe it or not, was a baritone guitar.
Right.
Now, baritone guitars, for those listeners who don't know what they are essentially regular guitars. They're 6-string guitars, but they're tuned usually a 4th or a 5th lower. So 4 scale steps or 5 scale steps lower than a regular guitar. So akin to, say, the saxophone family or the bowed string family, you've got various ranges of essentially the same instrument. So with a guitar, you have things like ukuleles, tenor guitars, regular guitars, baritone guitars, bass guitars now, because they're relatively new.
Right.
And then harp guitars, of course, are sort of like the extreme version of a bass guitar. So I asked you to make me a baritone, and I remember you kind of went, oh.
Well, that's, yeah, for sure. Because this has happened in my career. Every time I've come up, or I've introduced a new design or a new instrument or something, it's because somebody asks me to do it, and then I always go, oh, really? And then I have this mulling period, and then I start to warm up to it, and then I start getting excited about it, and then I go, right? And it's always the same pattern.
I remember at the time, too, you said, well, let me do the R&D.
Yeah.
And then you got back to me and you said, well, it's not that different from building a regular guitar.
No, it's cool because it is actually, essentially, it's a guitar that's tuned lower, right? You still play it. You don't play it like a bass, you play it like a guitar, but it's kind of like down halfway between the bass and the guitar. So that's really cool, and that was the first baritone I ever built.
So on a technical level, the guitar itself is strung with heavier strings than you would normally use.
Yes.
So what we ended up doing together was deciding that I already had these 66 gauge strings that I was using on a 7-string guitar that Oscar Graf had made me. And so I had, jillions of them because I had to order them by the half gross or something. So
Jillian, that's a lot.
Jillian, yeah, she's really cute and she's a lot. So I thought, okay, well, I've got all these 66 gauge strings already. So why don't we just use that as the bottom string, because that makes it easy. And what we ended up deciding might work, and I've done this ever since. Some people would disagree with me, is that I've done the 66 as the 6th position string, and then I've used the bottom 5 strings of a medium set for the other 5 positions.
Right.
So, for example, these days I'm using 66 as the 6th string, and then a 56, and then a 45, then a 34, a 26, and then a 17. So basically,
you're using basically a medium gauge set, and you're eliminating the high E string,
exactly,
and then adding.
Yeah,
that's really simple, and that seemed like an approach. And I'm not sure if that's very common. There's lots of baritone sets out there that are on the market now. I'm not sure what was happening back in the 90s, but it just seemed like a way it seemed a very simple way to deal with the string thing.
Well, back in the 90s, the baritone was still kind of very much a specialty instrument.
Very much, yeah, for sure.
So the way I got hooked on the baritone idea was a friend of mine gave me a coffee table book about the guitars made by Danny Farrington, who's out of California.
Okay.
And so he's really famous for making these acoustic guitars that kind of look like electric guitars.
Okay.
They've got kind of slender bodies and but a sound hole, and they've very often got these wild-looking shapes, kind of like electrics.
Are they electrified?
You can plug them in, put a pickup in them, and stuff like that.
Right.
But a lot of rock stars were getting them because they were acoustics that kind of looked electric, and they were kind of the design element.
Good on stage too.
Yeah, the design element was really there. And one of his specialties seemed to be making baritone guitars.
Okay.
It was the first time I'd ever heard of them. Yeah. So I thought, baritone, interesting. Okay, must be just tuned low. And I'm a low tuning guy. I love that stuff. So I thought, cool. And then I was in a recording studio working on a session, and the guy who owned the studio had a double neck Dan electric guitar sitting in the corner. And one neck was obviously a regular guitar, and the other neck I thought, it must be a bass. It's really long. And then I looked, it's got 6 strings on it. I said, wow, a 6-string bass as a double neck? What an interesting... No, wait a second. Those strings aren't quite thick enough. So I picked it up and I played. I realized, it's tuned, in fourths like a guitar. Oh, this must be a baritone. So on a break, I asked if I could plug it in, and I was really enchanted by the range. And so many things sounded so cool in it. And I thought, I've got to get a baritone one of these days.
Yeah.
So when you asked me, what is it you've always wanted that you don't have? I said, baritone.
Yeah.
And... So it uses heavier strings, And then, is there much that you have to do about like bracing the body differently or anything, or is the fact that the strings are at this lower tension anyway?
What I've accumulated, I've got a big, I don't know what you'd call it, a notebook, a binder with information like that. I'm constantly adding to it, like techniques and information and specs and stuff like that. So because often the methods that I use get kind of complicated, and if I don't write it down, I'm not going to remember next time I come around to it 3 months later, right?
Gotcha.
So part of that is I've amassed a list of string tensions of different types of sets and different strings. Okay, so I did that, and by doing that, I was able to determine that with a baritone, it's only slightly more tension on the neck than a regular set of strings. So I brace it a little differently, but not as much as you might think. They're not like super heavy, tense strings. So
I figured the string tension can't be that much different.
No, it's not, because they're longer, right? So they're tuned down, so that releases that lowers the tension. So it kind of balances out. They're not out of range too far.
I guess the big difference would be that instead of a thin little first string, you've got a great big fat sixth string.
Yeah.
So that would add that much more tension.
Well, I could show you the list at some point, and it's surprising because that doesn't mean they're getting more tense as they go down. There's some strings in there have more tension than others, even though it's not like an even range as you go to first to sixth. Mm-hmm. So it's just.
Well, you mentioned earlier that there are now baritone sets being made by guitar string manufacturers.
Yeah. You can
For example, a friend of mine had an endorsement with D'Addario for a while. So they sent him a million sets of strings for his baritone. And then he switched endorsements or whatever. So he had all these extra strings. He says, well, you play baritone here.
Yeah. What'd you think?
Well, they didn't work for me.
Okay.
The weird thing I find is that for whatever reason, when baritone string sets are manufactured, they're manufactured with a plain second string. Now that second string, if you tune to B, which is what most people tune to, the second string ends up being tuned to F sharp.
Okay.
And that's only a semitone lower than G, which is where you would. So not to get too arcane, but the second string in a baritone is essentially the same string that you would use for the third string on a regular guitar.
Right.
So I thought to myself, on a regular guitar, you've got a wound string in the third position.
Right.
Sure, the first two strings are plain on a regular guitar. So they seem to think that it's, philosophically, it's people will take to it better if the first two strings are plain.
Visually it'll look right or something,
or whatever, or it'd just be too weird to have 5 wound strings on the guitar. I don't find it weird at all, but I mean, especially since that note is so close to a G anyway, that it resonates properly. It sounds really good when you use a wound string. So they package them with these really thick second strings that I think sound terrible. They're too clangy and they go way out of tune up the neck and stuff like that. So they have severe intonation problems, and they pretty much all come with a 70 gauge bottom string.
That's right. I was going to mention that part because the sets that I've used, I noticed right away they use a 70 gauge bottom, which has caused me some problems. I've had to drill out the little string hole on my tuner on occasion just to get it through there.
Exactly.
It's very heavy.
What they do, I know, with the commercial sets of strings is they very often leave a lot of plain string, but still, you'd have to turn that sucker a million times to get it around the machine head.
Right.
So what I found was the 70 causes that problem, and I can sort of force one through the hole in the machine head if I have to, if I reluctantly use a 70. But then the problem also with the 70 is that a lot of people love having this big cable for their sixth string, and you can tune really low and it sounds like a note, which is great. But what ends up happening is that the harmonics are really strange on the string. I think that what ends up happening is because it's pretty, again, not to be too arcane, but these days I'm using the aluminum bronze set by Ernie Ball, because they offered me a deal with them, and it took me a while to get used to them because I was used to phosphor bronze strings. I always had For years, I used pierced phosphor bronze strings, and you get used to the harmonic content that's there in the phosphor bronze. They tend to be very clangy and lots of high harmonics, especially on the bottom strings. You can really hear them. With the aluminum bronze strings, the Ernie Ball strings, the fundamental is much more clear and isolated. The harmonics are less exaggerated with those strings.
Interesting.
But you can never find a 66 gauge string or anything like that that's made out of aluminum bronze. They just don't make them very often.
Make them. Yeah.
They were making them for a very short time for harp guitars, and then they kind of stopped making them. So I end up having to use a phosphor anyway.
How does that work, the combination of the two?
It's fine.
Okay.
Because the 66, just because after you play it for a little while, the bottom string tends to go a little bit dead first anyway, like faster than the other ones. But the 70 goes dead really fast. and then and then when I first have it on, it's so clangy and weird sounding. So again, it's funny. It sounds like, well, you're being too much of a fusspot, Don. But
you've earned the right.
But I like how things sound, right? I'm a sound guy.
Yeah,
it's one of the reasons I like playing your guitars. They sound so good, right? So sound is everything, So if the combination of the instrument and the strings has to be just right. Antoine Zufour, for example, great guitarist from Quebec, he works with Mario Beauregard, the builder from South Shore of Montreal.
Yeah,
and Mario built him a baritone, and they together they sort of did all these maths together to figure out exactly which string gauges to use and stuff like. And that's great. And in fact, when I told Antoine that I just used a set of mediums with a 66, he just shook his head and he says, "No." And I said, "It's okay, Antoine. I knew you'd disagree, but this is what I've done for 25 years, and it works. It's great. Yeah. So no problem."
That's funny. Wow.
Okay, so the baritone guitar, I threw that as a curve at you, and then I think the next interesting curve was a few years later. You came to one of my shows, and you asked me, "What do you think of these fanfret things?" And I said, "I don't know. I think they're pretty cool. I think it's a cool idea. Like the idea behind it, I think, is really interesting." And
yes,
people like Michael Greenfield, who makes my wife Brooke Miller's guitars, he was starting to do it. He was starting basically to encourage people to choose it because it comes out of the whole idea of putting. Well, it became popular again in the 20th century when bass guitars especially started getting extra strings on them. And people were finding that once you got beyond 4 strings, boy, the strings, the difference in gauge was so big from first string to 5th or 6th or 7th or 8th or 12th string, that they would not play in tune at all. And so more and more guitars started being, especially on the electric side of things, started using, and 7-string electrics started using fanfrets. And then it sort of spilled over into the acoustic world a lot more. So I remember you asking me, "What do you think about this fanfret idea?" I said, I would encourage it, So you made me your first fanfret guitar, I think.
Yeah. That was another one of these moving in a certain direction because of a request for a guitar, right? And that was a tricky one. That's one that I've been working on. And I mean, the fanfret is actually much more complicated than a regular guitar, over and above the fact that it's the strings, the frets are made in a fan. I mean, there's lots of little technical things about the fanfret that you have to, that are not like a normal guitar.
And just to back up, in case people don't know what a fanfret guitar is. Right. Fanfrets, the whole idea is that instead of having straight frets with all the frets going up and down, sort of perpendicular to the string, the nut of the guitar and the saddle of the guitar are actually angled opposite to each other. So it's almost like if you look at the shape of the longest string, and then you look at the saddle and the nut, and then the shape of the bottom string, it almost looks like a trapezoid instead of a rectangle.
Yeah, that's right.
And the whole idea is that each successively thicker string has a longer scale length. So at first, when you look at it, you think that there's something wrong with my contact lenses or something,
You're right.
Or I must have had one too many last night. And then you realize, oh no, there's some sort of method to this madness. So can you explain like the Novak system and all this kind of stuff, and what it really does? No.
I have a really hard time explaining, other than it just makes sense. The string, the natural resonance or vibration of a string is suited to the thickness. A thick string will have its optimum vibration if it's longer. Like a piano, right?
Like a piano,
a piano.
exactly.
Like the high strings are really short because that's their optimum vibration is a certain length, right? And when you have a regular guitar, a standard guitar, which is fine, it's been fine for centuries, and but it's always a compromise, like none of the strings are, well, maybe one or two are the exact length they should be, and then there's the others are compromised. So in a fanfret, the strings are their optimum length, at least closer to their optimum length, and so it just seems to work. Unfortunately, scientifically, technically, I can't explain, the theory behind it, but it does work.
Sure. And in my experience as a player of fanfret instruments now for a number of years, the main advantage is that the bottom strings can be tuned below pitch.
Right.
And you still have a very strong fundamental.
Right.
So, normally your bottom string's tuned to that E, and then you can tune it down to a D or a C or a B or whatever, and you still have lots and lots of fundamental. It's not farting, it's not flopping around.
Right.
So it's really liberating that way. And so I found that now my propensity to use all these different altered tunings, I use probably over 100
You
of
don't
them.
use any altered tunings,
One
do
or
you?
two. I do have a page on my website, on the Don Ross Online website. It's just a tuning page. It's like a database. Yeah. And I always get these emails from people saying, I'm trying your tuning for Klimbim, which is a horrible tuning. It's down to a B on the bottom, and you have to tune your first string up to an F sharp. So you got to have a nice fresh string on there.
Wow.
All the other strings get tuned down. And they say, I keep breaking the first string. What can I do? And I just say, well, just use the newest string you possibly can. But the fanfret has really made the altered tuning thing so much better for me. I mean, it's made a big difference.
Yeah, I can see why.
So now when I tour, I tend to tour with 3 guitars. And so I play on stage now a baritone that you made for me. It's the one that you made for me, I think, in 2008. It's
okay.
Yeah, so it's
it's still in one piece?
Oh yeah. Well, you've repaired it once or twice, but yeah, it's still tour worthy, and I've got it with me on the road right now.
Okay.
And it's
it's a regular 28-inch baritone?
I don't know anything about the lengths of the.
Well, I've only built two scales,
you.
right? We started at 27 because I was just grabbing a number. And then realized later that after a year or 2, 3 or whatever, realized that making it a little longer would give you more ability to tune down. And, so 28 is pretty well all I use now for either the baritone, or if I'm doing a fanfret with a baritone bottom, I'll go to 28. Generally, I don't think it's been quite a while since I built a 27.
This particular one, I'm sure there's at least a good 2-inch difference between the first string and the sixth string in terms of the length because of the fanfret on it.
Oh, are you saying your 2008's a fanfret?
It is.
Oh, I see. I'm sorry. I thought it was a straight fret.
No, you made me 2 straight fret baritones, and then this was a fanfret.
Okay.
And it's the fanfret that I really fell in love with. I mean, the other ones sounded amazing, but this one was just so good. And I took delivery of it right in the middle of this big tour I was doing with Andy McKee. We did an album together, and the first gig we used it at was in Gothenburg, Sweden.
Whoa!
And we had I would always bring a baritone with me, and we'd sort of hand it back and forth for the arrangements that used a baritone. And so he'd play it sometimes, I'd play it sometimes. And we were both, when we first got that guitar, it was just like, oh my God, it sounds so good, but I'm making all these weird mistakes on the top notes, because you'd look down at a position marker, for the sixth string, and you'd think that the first string would be the same. And of course you forget, oh no, it's a fanfret.
Right.
I'm completely used to it now, of course, but at first I was playing a lot of really cool variations on some of the high melodies. But so I used that one, the 2008 baritone. And then in 2017, you made like a 20th anniversary guitar for me, and that's a fanfret regular pitch guitar. Both those guitars are made with spruce and cocobolo, and cocobolo back and side. It's very beautiful, sort of relative to rosewood. I guess it's an African wood, isn't it?
No, cocobolo is a Central South American, and it's a member of the rosewood family.
Yeah, and it's very beautiful looking, and it sounds great. Then the harp guitar, of course, that you made me just recently, that was another curveball I threw at you. So
It certainly was.
So I am really...
That was a big curveball.
I've never really asked you your process for building that guitar, because something that listeners should know is that 2 or 3 years ago, when I first got the guitar, I guess I've had it for 4 years now. When I first got it, I had to get my chops back, because I hadn't played harp guitar in like 25 years.
You had borrowed a guitar for a while, hadn't you?
That's right. I borrowed a Dyer harp guitar back in the late 80s or something, and I learned how to play it and could play it quite well, and wrote some tunes. Then had to give it back, and I couldn't afford to buy it off the guy, so I just didn't play one for 25 years. And then I was in India on tour, and I met a builder of harp guitars there, who I just found out just passed away, unfortunately. And I think his name was Arul. Anyway, he made the Dyer style harp guitar. And so I played his prototype, and I thought, I can still do it. Look at that. I can't believe it. I thought, it's like riding a bike, I guess. So I got home from that trip, and I wrote to you and I said, Mark, will you consider making... Anyway, so... And you were like, well, okay, it's going to be another R&D trip.
Yeah, no kidding. That's a big one, because the Baritone is, that was one thing, but it's basically a lower, bigger guitar or whatever,
So
whereas
the
harp guitar is a whole different thing.
A whole different thing.
Yeah.
What I did when I took delivery of it, I relearned a Michael Hedges tune that I used to play 100 years ago.
Yeah.
And I made a little video of it. I put it up on YouTube. And then I ended up getting, as a result of that, I got invited to the Harp Guitar Gathering, which is kind of like a Star Wars convention for players of the harp guitar. So it happens, in various places in the States every year. That particular year, it was in Milford, Connecticut. So I could drive, because I live in Halifax. It's, it wasn't that bad a drive. And so I went down with your harp guitar that you made me. And the world expert on the harp guitar, I never get his first name right. It's either Glenn Miner or Greg Miner. I think it's Greg Miner. He listened to the guitar plugged in, and he said, oh my God, it sounds so good plugged in. Can I play it a little bit acoustically? And it was just sitting on a table, and he just played the notes open, and he said, you tell Marc Beneteau that I've seen them all, I've heard them all, I've played them all, and he's hit a home run on his very first harp guitar. And I
better not build any more then.
Well, yeah, no, you can quit while you're ahead.
Yeah.
Last year I did a show in the Washington, D.C. area, and there was a builder there who came, and he's a player of the harp guitar himself. And I think that particular trip, it was impossible for me to bring the harp guitar with me because of my tour. It just had too much stuff, and I was playing with someone else, and it was just not practical. So he said, I'm so sad you couldn't bring your harp guitar with you. I said, I really wanted to hear that Beneteau. And I said, yeah. I said, it's great. He says, well, Greg Miner says it's the best harp guitar ever made. So I'm, again, not blowing smoke, but ridiculous. It's the truth. So that guitar now, among harp guitarists, all 45 of them that there are in the world, that guitar has the rep of being the best one. Isn't that something?
That's I'm speechless. I don't know what to say.
Pretty cool, huh? Yeah, I figured I'd save that story from when we were actually recording.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. So anyway, tell me a bit about the R&D you had to do for that, because you made an amazing instrument.
Yeah, that was a big. That took me 2 years. I don't know if you recall that, but it took 2 years from the time you mentioned it until the time it was delivered. And
I thought it was going to take 5, so 2 was amazing.
Yeah, but I'd put the jets on a little bit for you. But I had to try and figure out every aspect of it, every part of it. And make all, I couldn't use regular guitar molds. I had to make a special mold, special fixtures, special everything, templates, the whole kit and caboodle. And I was kind of feeling my way through it and how to make it, because it's normally the way I normally build guitars is essentially the factory way, in which I build the body separately from the neck, and they don't get attached until all the finishing is done and everything right at the very end. With a harp guitar, you can't do that, because that big arm of the harp is always there, so that kind of it gets in the way of a lot of procedures. Plus, normally I use a process, and this is, I don't know if I'll be able to describe this properly, but I use what I believe is an old Asian process for gluing on the braces to the top and back, and also in gluing the top and back together. It's a matter of using, they call them go bars, and you have a big frame, and you have these sticks that bend. They're bendable sticks, and you use those for pressure all the way around the guitar, whether it's on the braces or for gluing the top and back together, and as opposed to clamps. And it's a great system.
Yeah. Okay.
But normally I have this go bar deck, which is essentially a box that I put the body into, and then I use the bars to apply pressure by putting them against the top of the box. The bar sits against the top of the box and then is bent and puts pressure on whatever you're gluing underneath it. So it's a little hard to visualize, I suppose, but it's a really cool system. Well, with a harp guitar, I couldn't stick it in this little box because the harp guitar was twice as big. Mm-hmm. So I had to come up with a way of attaching two boxes together because I happened to have two.
Dear
and
Lord.
Then, it was, the whole thing was a learning curve from beginning to end. And the bracing was totally different because you've got two sets of strings, so you have to brace it in a way that pulls in two different directions as opposed to just one. On top of that, this was a harp guitar. No, sorry, it was a fanfret harp guitar, which added another element to it, right? So the whole thing was really kind of interesting, but a bit of a challenge. And I don't know, were you probably aware that when I built it, there was a little bit of I noticed that the harp guitar side was, or the sub bass side, the top was kind of bowing a little bit because I didn't brace it exactly right, so I had to go back inside and add a brace to it. Amazing. Which obviously solved the problem because it's okay to this day. Right, right, yeah. So it was a bit of a crapshoot when I was trying to design the bracing, and I didn't get it quite right. And if I ever do another fanfret, I'll take care of that from the beginning. The other part of this project that was a challenge for me was when the guitar was done, I had to come up with a case.
I know, that's actually kind of like part of the one of the most amazing things about it, because you made like the most amazing case.
I'm a case maker, you know that. I didn't make the case, but I thought, well, I we needed something like in a flight case type thing, and I realized that certain keyboard cases might work. Mm-hmm. And there was a fella out of Toronto who's a piano player, and he was selling a piano flight case. So I went out there with the guitar, because I think it was close to completion. I could carry it with me. And I met him at his house, and we checked, and it was going to fit in this case.
Right.
So I bought the case off him, and then I had to figure out how to do the inside of the case.
You custom padded it. I know. It's gorgeous.
Yeah, that was interesting. I was able to buy that lining, that whatever you call crushed velour kind of stuff, and so that worked out, and learned how to do that. So
it's remarkable because it fits so perfectly in the case. It just does not move.
Well, that was important, right? Because I didn't want it bouncing around. That's
when you
sure.
think too, I mean, an instrument that big, and there's so much empty space. I mean, you've got the huge chamber to deal with. So I mean, it's a very crushable instrument. So it has to be something that's built like Fort Knox.
It sure is heavy enough, isn't it?
Yeah.
The case is really heavy.
And the sad thing is, too, that I ended up having this bad experience.
No, you didn't.
Yes, I did. I've traveled with that guitar all over the world now. I've taken it all over Asia. I've taken it all over Europe. I've taken it all over North America. It travels a lot. And it's been in so many airplanes, and I never worry about it because it's in this fantastic case. And there's even like a little bit of room in it, like, because of the way that the guitar is constructed and stuff. So I can roll up, even for extra padding, I can roll up a few souvenir T-shirts and put them in there and stuff. Like it's great, and there's no worries. Mm-hmm. Sure enough, when I first got it, one of the first things I did was I ordered a gig bag. Because I thought, there's going to be times when I can drive to a gig, and I can just... So, like, for example, when I went to the harp guitar gathering, I brought it down in a gig bag.
Yeah.
And...
save a lot of weight that way.
Yeah, for sure. But you obviously can't fly with those.
No.
But if you can drive, hey, it's nice. And of course, it's like a backpack, and you can carry other stuff at the same time. All is well. Well, I've only ever had a chance to use the gig bag maybe 3 times. Up until this one episode back in March, I was asked to play this event only an hour from where I live in Nova Scotia. So I thought, okay, great. I can bring the harp guitar and just bring it in the gig bag. And wow, what a novelty. So I did that. And then I arrived at the venue, and my wife, Brooke, was helping me load stuff in. And I didn't notice when I had loaded the guitar into the back of the car that I guess the straps that go over your shoulders, I had at one point tightened them up, I guess so that they wouldn't get caught on other things, wherever I was storing the case. And I hadn't loosened them again so that a human being could get one's arm in there. So I pulled the guitar out, and I was going to try to put my arm through the strap, thinking it was loose. Meanwhile, I was being distracted by somebody who, hey, Don, nice to see you, blah, blah, blah. And all of this happened so quickly, and I went to put my arm through, and it was cool out. I was wearing a jacket. My jacket sleeve got caught on the strap. Ooh. And literally, the guitar in the case went flying over my head.
Oh, my gosh.
And it landed, boink, on the ground, head first. And I thought, that could not have been good. No. And I thought, something bad has happened to the guitar.
Right.
And I unzipped it, and sure enough, the headstock for the contrabass strings had broken clean in half.
Clean is the operative word.
Yes.
Because that's good.
Yes. So, of course, I was crestfallen, like Tom Swift when he dropped the toothpaste. But I thought, okay, well, at least it's relatively clean looking. I'm sure Mark can do it. So poor Mark, I have asked you so many times to fix guitars, and I consider myself actually quite lucky because I've flown thousands of times, and
right.
I've only had maybe 4 things happen to guitars.
Yeah, the track record is actually quite good.
It's actually not bad. Yeah. But I had to ship the harp guitar back to you. And can you explain to me and us how you managed to do such an amazing job where you can't even tell what happened?
Well, the bottom line is that it cracked cleanly. Mm-hmm. Okay, so the basic head could go back together pretty nicely. I had to fill in a couple spots, but not much, and that was a big help. Part of the challenge was to clamp the head back together. Okay, because
it's a very strange shape.
Yeah, it's a strange shape, so you can't. It's not a simple matter to just stick a clamp on it.
Right.
So I had to come up with a setup where I could clamp it effectively, and you only have one chance to glue this because you when you take the clamps off, you don't want it to have shifted or anything else weird. So you do a lot. It's the old measure twice, cut once. Well, I kind of check this out about 100 times before I go ahead and make sure everything's just right. I used hide glue to glue it back together, and the reason for that is that hide glue is not noticeable under lacquer, whereas if you use regular wood glue, it will be.
Right.
It'll show through. It'll show as a line. So that's one thing. And then the bindings, the little purflings, how do we explain that so that they know what we're talking about? Just the edge trim around the head had to be replaced in sections because it had obviously broken in half. So I did that. I refinished. And then I realized when I was working on this thing, back to the fact that it's more complicated to work on because you've got this, you got a neck and then you've got another part of the body, and so you can't get at it as well, is that for respraying the guitar, I had to take the regular neck off, which I normally would never do unless I had to. But I had to because that was the only way I could spray the head. Wow. Normally, the six string, the standard part of the guitar head is almost stuck against the contrabass head.
Right.
Okay, so they're very, very close together. So you can't get in there and spray that part of the head. I had to spray the section of the head along with a little bit of the body that attaches to it in order to do a proper job. So I had to take the regular neck off to do that and then put it back on after. Luckily, I use a bolt-on neck, so it's not that difficult.
Wow, that's like the surgical operation that you just described.
Yeah, well, it's the kind of thing you have to think about it to go, how am I going to approach this? What am I going to do? Make sure, and again, you only have one chance.
Yeah.
Like when you're gluing this together, you want it to end up right, so you take a lot of precautions to make sure it's going to be right before you start.
Well, you did such an amazing job that when I got it back, I thought that what you had done was that you had actually cut a whole new headstock for the contrabass strings.
Right.
And that's what I was telling people. I said, I think he just replaced this entire piece of wood. I can't believe it. And then finally my mother-in-law my mother-in-law said, well, actually, if you look at it really carefully, like if you kind of squint and get as close as you can, you can just barely sort of see a slight difference. Oh, yeah. But you have to literally you have to look at it through a
it's
telescope.
not the kind of thing that you can probably find it, but it's not the kind of thing that you would ever notice or think about unless you knew it was there.
If you knew, you'd have to know. Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Exactly.
No, it's an astounding repair job. So anyway, that guitar plays like it always did, and it sounds great. Didn't lose anything, so that's great.
Good.
So that's the first part of my interview with Marc Beneteau. We talked for quite a while the day that I visited him, so this will extend into a second part, which I'll upload next. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. Don't forget that one way that you can learn even more about the guitar than you ever thought you would ever have to know is by checking out my teaching website, which is donrossguitaracademy.com. Right now I have 40 beginner lessons and another 40 intermediate lessons uploaded. And you can take it from right at the very beginning all the way into the whole world of alternate tunings and slide guitar and learning some of my tunes and all that kind of stuff. We're adding more content all the time, so you can decide to subscribe for a month or whatever and take it all in and then cancel any time, or you can just keep going. The nice thing too is that you get to join the Don Ross Guitar Academy Facebook group, where you find out a lot of updates and that kind of thing. Also, that Facebook group helps point you to our weekly live stream that I do on YouTube Live, which is members only. So we have a lot of fun. There's a community of people from all over the world who switch in every week, and we talk about guitars, and we have special guests, people like Andy McKee and Callum Graham and Christy Lene and Janet Noguera and luthier Michael Greenfield and Petteri Sariola, and the list goes on. So make sure to check that out if you get a chance, donrossguitaracademy.com. So thanks for checking this out, and the next episode of Guitar Case featuring part 2 of this interview with Marc Beneteau will be up good and soon. See you then.